Hello and welcome to the HR People Pod, the CIPD's fortnightly podcast, bringing you the topical stories and expert insights on issues impacting the people profession and the world of work. I am not David D'Souza, as you may have noticed. I'm Amanda Arrowsmith, the People and Transformation Director at the CIPD, sitting in for David for this week's episode. And joining me...
It's David Blackburn. I'm very glad it's you, Amanda, because it was very annoying when there's two Davids in the room. I'm David Blackburn. I'm the Managing Director of David R. Blackburn Consulting Limited, and I'm a Chartered Companion of the CIPD.
So I'm Elizabeth Harvey. I'm Head of HR at HSBC for the UK functions, and I'm delighted to join you.
Thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you both join the show, and my first one hosting, so I appreciate it. Be gentle with me. So before we get into the details, I'd like to hear a bit more about you. So perhaps you can tell me something that you've been reading, watching, been up to recently. David, do you want to start?
Yes, so I was delighted that season 2 of Pachinko has just gone live on Apple TV. If you don't know it, Pachinko is an amazing novel about it's a long saga of a single family, a single woman's journey, and it's set in South Korea and Japan. And when I read the novel, I knew nothing about that history, that time of part of the world, and it's been serialized and it's incredible.
And so go back and watch the first series?
Go back and watch the first series, yes, because otherwise it won't make sense. So yes, it's a linear journey of one individual, a female character, and how she traverses her own journey, her family journey during a really turbulent period of Japan's invasion of South Korea, and she goes to live in Japan, and it's amazing. There are episodes that are absolutely so incredibly emotional. You'll be in floods. Well, I was certainly in floods. I'm in floods, and I cry at lots of things. But that really, it's a real emotional roller coaster. But it's brilliantly written and beautifully filmed.
Fantastic, thank you, Elizabeth. What have you been up to?
So I'd say I'm not as sophisticated because I'm definitely watching Married at First Sight, which just gives me a bit of a kind of a brain rest. But otherwise, I'm currently on a program called Solaris, which is a female leadership development program. And we have an amazing powerhouse, Yatunde Hoffman, and she has a book called Beyond Engagement, which is all about love-based leadership. So, you know, what would happen to the world? What would business, what would it be like in the workplace if we had the premise of love as a starting place? So it's a really powerful book, which I'd encourage you all to pick up. And she's an amazing leader, I must say, a privilege to kind of engage with her on a one-to-one basis as well.
Yeah, she is. I think we can all agree that Yatunde is definitely a powerhouse. Yeah. I've been doing my homework ahead of ACE, so it's our annual conference and exhibition in 2 weeks' time, in November. So I've been doing my homework, and I've got the pleasure of hosting one of our keynotes, which is Bruce Daisley. So I've been rereading some of his books and some of his works, but also I've been listening to his podcast and just kind of getting so it's Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. And I've been getting into that again just to get myself prepared for meeting with Bruce. Before we move into our first topics, I just want to give everyone what might be a really timely reminder, is that on October the 26th, employers have a duty to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment of employees and workers in the course of their employment. Whilst we're not going to be talking about that today, I think it's really important just to remind people that's coming in. If you haven't prepared for it, you should be preparing for it. So we want to make sure people are thinking about that, and perhaps listen to one of our previous podcasts where we talked about what employers could do and how that might work. Okay then, let's get into our first topic of discussion. Over the past fortnight, we've seen a number of headlines around the theme of workplace wellbeing. We've heard for calls to increase statutory sick pay and have seen reports around proposals to trial weight loss jabs as a way to tackle worklessness, and just recently have observed Menopause Awareness Day. I'm sure we've got opinions on all those headlines, but that's not what we're going to open our discussion about. I want to pick up on the headline stemming from a study conducted by the Royal Society for Public Health that reports that half of UK workforce lacks access to reliable workplace health support. This includes things like winter flu vaccinations and checks for cardiovascular diseases. Furthermore, the Institute for Public Policy Research made the headlines this week when it suggested that employers who fail to provide healthy work environments for their staff, such as subsidised nutritious food, should face regulatory action, including fines and public censure. So let's start with, what is an employer's responsibility and where is the line around that?
I think this is not a new topic, and we've been talking about what constitutes a healthy workplace for at least the last 15 years, if not longer. And I think that the balance around what are you, the employee, as an individual accountable for versus what is the employer accountable for, I think is a line that has been constantly moving and shifting, especially post the pandemic. And whilst very often the idea is a great one, why would we not want all environments to be a healthy working environment? Everyone's going to sign up to that and going to say yes. I think those things are only possible if we have the right investment in the infrastructure that sits behind it. So when we make policy decisions or the government makes policy announcements, then it's backed up by the right skills and supports, because employers simply can't do all of it themselves. The example, I'd give is that, investment in occupational health, and we were talking about it before we sat down in the studio, is the fact that, back in 2010, the Fit Note revolution was supposed to be supported by a whole investment in occupational health, that actually the ability to have meaningful conversation about what an employee could do versus what they couldn't do, all of that great, great idea was not backed up by the required investment. So actually what we have today is a system that doesn't work, and that recently we're talking about, are we a sick note culture and all that sort of thing. So I think where the accountability sits, most organizations, that observation about the meals, for example, many organizations, that just would not be feasible. It would not be financially viable. It wouldn't be possible. And I think that we shouldn't be, rather than trying to treat the symptoms, which very often we are in this space, let's have a fruit bowl, let's have massages, don't get me on my whole well-being on that one. What does well-being look like? But so actually we'll do all of that stuff. Actually, we'd be better off focusing on what are the root causes of employee illness, sickness, absence, all of that sort of stuff. So I just think there is a responsibility and accountability for employers, but I think defining what that is, the devil is in the detail, and I think it can't just be more for the employers to do.
Where are you coming from on this, Elizabeth?
So it's a massively important topic, and we've seen so much change in the last couple of years, apps like Headspace and so on. But I think employees also have a choice. They have a choice to make, and you've seen organisations who offer unlimited holiday. You then find that they're having to force or push colleagues to take extra holiday because they haven't even taken the statutory minimum. So that employee choice also comes into this. And as we were talking, there's something around the parent-child relationship. Yeah. And so where does the burden really lie? And on the employer, there is only so much that certain organisations can do. And you'll have, huge organisations who, from a total compensation perspective, they can do private medical, they can do group income protection, they can do additional pay in terms of sickness, and you name it. And there's so much in that, whereas smaller organisations aren't able to access this. They're not able to do so for their employee. The Institute talks about, kind of an FCA-like regulation. And so consumer duty comes to mind about, the need to not do harm to colleagues. But I think it's putting too much burden on business, on the employer, versus actually how do we understand what colleagues and employees really want, and where can the government also play in these spaces rather than trying to push it across to the right.
I worry a little bit about the potential impact on people who aren't considered to be the normal healthy. So, if you've got someone who's perhaps a little bit overweight, or you've got someone who has a disability, or someone has a physical impairment, this push for workplace well-being and this health requirement, what does that do for us as employers? And I'm really interested in where you think we draw the line and what we can and can't do.
I think that's a really good observation, Amanda, and it links back to what Alison was saying about, what's the employee and the employer's responsibility around health, because health is intrinsically something really quite personal.
Yeah.
And to your point, will be very different for different individuals at different life stages. And if you think about the journey that organisations have been on, and we've been on in society, Menopause Awareness Day that you've just been talking about, well, that didn't exist 10 years ago. And we understand neurodivergence in a way that is different. We understand long-term health conditions in a way that is different, long COVID, post the pandemic. So I think that there's a huge amount of nuance to this. And I think that's often the response sometimes is a very binary response. I love Alison's observation about, that what they're suggesting is sort of, because in my head, I'm 10 years in the financial services sector. Yes, I thought, well, it's a bit like the consumer duty, isn't it? But the minute you start getting into that sort of space that says, I'm going to regulate this thing, I'm going to fine you if you're not. I mean, I just think that, that's a sort of one size fits all idea. I don't even know what that framework would look like. And how would you apply it to, the host of SMEs, for example, that make up such a huge part of the workforce in the UK economy, who won't even be, they've got lots of other stuff to be getting on with and thinking about. It's not that having a healthy workplace isn't important. We all absolutely agreed about that. But how you go about achieving that, I'm not sure fining people is the right answer.
So, Elizabeth, what does a healthy workplace look like?
So a healthy workplace really needs to have a baseline of trust. So I think you could have all the benefits in the world, you could have all the different factors, health checks, you name it, that pick up things kind of proactively, as you talked about, David. But really, health is so personal, to your point, that I have to be able to share that with my line manager or with my organisation. So when we talk about wellbeing, I think the premise of trust or psychological safety to allow you to speak up. So, I'm not feeling too well today, or I'm going to take this time off without any unintended consequences. That's really important. And also, I think being able for colleagues to come together and share their opinions. So, we talked about, is it healthy, nutritious meals at a good cost price? Well, can we talk about that? Can we be part of the decisions that are made for the rest of the organisation? How do you kind of collectively come together to make sure we're providing the right support for the colleagues in that organisation?
I love that idea, because that also comes back to that inclusion point, because it's great if you want to do a team competition around a walk. So let's all walk the Great Wall of China I did once in one organisation where all the team walked it, but we needed to find a way to make that inclusive. So how do you do that for people who perhaps can't walk, who can't do exercise, who can't do physical things? And having that employee involvement, I think, is a real opportunity to support that. Have you got any suggestions or tips that you'd say, if you're going to say into an organisation, what's the one thing you'd like to see people do? Elizabeth, anything from you?
I think there are definitely things that are getting more standardised around health checks, and even from kind of the meal provisions around a vegan week, vegetarian week, just variety of cultures and so on, whereas you can taste things maybe on a basis to improve your whole lifestyle. So things that you can introduce in the workplace that might just tip someone to do something more holistically for their lifestyle and their families, I think are really important to change wellbeing.
Yeah, I like that. David, anything from you?
Yes, I think Elizabeth's right. And I should actually say, I think I've been getting your name wrong in the earlier night. So I just think that's my menopausal brain.
Oh, which apparently is a thing.
It is a thing. Thank you very much.
No offense taken.
It's Elizabeth. Alison, Amanda, David. Sorry, yeah. Elizabeth. I think Elizabeth is right. It's the small nudgy things that you can do, which sometimes isn't about a health check or a thing. It's just about a conversation. So creating a space where actually you're making that front of mind for colleagues so that actually they're thinking about it. So then that might make them go away and take individual accountability for doing something. So yeah, I agree. I think the more we have a conversation about why it is important and how we can support you, but without that necessarily being, here's a fruit basket. Yeah.
I think the one practical thing... I love our fruit basket.
I mean, I love a fruit basket.
The one practical thing that I would suggest is there is something you can sign up to called Time to Test, which just encourages employers to give people time off to go to the health checks that they're asked to go to.
That's good.
So if you as a woman are asked to go for a smear test, that's generally during the working day. give people time to test. Don't make them take holiday to have those health checks that actually are going to do preventative medicine and help them in the future and those sort of things. I'm going to switch topic, if I may, because I think it's actually quite interesting that I think we'll make these two come together and related. But I want to move on and talk about how earlier this week the new real living wage rates were announced, seeing a 5% 60p increase to £12.60 per hour across the UK and 5.3% or a 70% increase to £13.85 in London. In the CIPD's Labour Market Outlook in summer 2024, we explored employers' approaches to the voluntary real living wage, with accredited employers citing it's fair or the right thing to do, and that opting into the recommended wage rate can improve employee financial well-being as core reason to commit to paying the wage. Of course, we also are aware that there are a number of employees who are not officially accredited but choose to pay workers at or above the voluntary living wage. But even with that, 25% of employers across large and small organisations have no intention to increase their minimum pay rate to match or exceed the voluntary living wage. And there's a wide range of reasons for that, and cost being one. But I want to open up the conversation a bit around your thoughts on the real living wage, and particularly how that might impact on what those employers that can't afford to do it could do it. Elizabeth, do you want to start us off?
I'm a complete advocate, Amanda, I would say. You know, the Living Wage Foundation, it's fantastic to see the movement that they've created across such a huge spectrum of employers. I think they have something like 15,000 employers that are now signed on. And, you know, some of those employee benefits that are then seen around productivity, recruitment, even investment, coming back into those industries. So there is something that is right there. And I love what you shared around the fact that it is the right thing to do. Albeit it can be hard for every type of organisation to do so. And, you know, your larger organisation will easily be able to say, yep, sign up here. Or even if they haven't signed up, you know, they know that their pay is a premium to that living wage. Smaller organisations, entrepreneurs that are hiring a few people, you know, how can they afford to do that? I think this is where the government also needs to kind of support and build some infrastructure around this. And I know there's conversations around the minimum wage, whether that should move towards being the real living wage. And that will be really hard for those industries. And I suppose there is a tipping point here. We're seeing mass unemployment in the market, and we're seeing the number of vacancies decrease. LinkedIn talked about the fact that, you know, suddenly we'll see a huge shift and we'll see colleagues kind of just moving around jobs as the market starts to pick up. So whilst it's great for bigger organisations who can build in that infrastructure, some of those smaller organisations, they're going to need support. And, you know, whether it's the government, whether it's larger organisations leaning in to help others out, to try and make sure that, you know, from an economics perspective, you know, we're able to have spare money to spend and, you know, build the UK economy. There's something there that needs to kind of shift.
Like Elizabeth, I'm an absolute advocate. And have been a real living wage foundation supporter and member in all of the organisations that I've worked in, probably for the last decade. How long has the Real Living Wage Foundation been going? Probably as long as that, I think, would be my guess. I think that the challenge, as you've both mentioned, is not just by size and scale of organisation, but it's also within sectors. And, earlier this year, I spent 6 months as the interim executive director of people at MENCAP, the Royal MENCAP Society. It's one of the largest charities in the UK, employs 8,000 people. About 90% of the workforce are paid the national minimum wage. And that's because that's what the charity can afford. And really, support workers do incredibly valuable, important, complex, often very complex roles supporting adults with learning disabilities with complex needs. And there's a bit like the conversation we were having earlier about, are we treating the symptom or are we treating the root cause? I agree the journey surely must be from minimum wage towards the real living wage. That should be an aspiration. If that's the aspiration, then I think the question is, how is that achievable? And exactly as Elizabeth said, is that businesses supporting other businesses? How do we do that? But also, I think that, there is a fundamental debate, and I'm really delighted that the new government want to have that debate about social care as a sector and pay rates, and is it aligned to the NHS and all of that good stuff. I think that's massively important. So actually, I am a huge advocate and a supporter. It's just not feasible, financially viable, even for big organisations in the charity sector, but it should be. And I think how do we answer that question, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah, so it's that financial reality of how you can support people, particularly the risk of the working poor, which we know is increasing. We're seeing that increase, aren't we? We talked earlier before we came in about the increased use in food banks and how that supports. And it's where the employer fits within that and how you support your employees, which almost comes back to what we're talking about, healthy, and that kind of that place of having a healthy workplace, of how you can support employers around that. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure what any of you say.
No, I mean, Amanda, that's a really good point, isn't it? About, the thing that always strikes me is, and someone I'm sure will correct me if I'm wrong. So I think we're the 5th largest economy in the world. We're, in the G7, and so we're either 5th or 6th, and so there's a lot of money in UK PLC. There just is. Now, I'm not a Marxist. I'm not saying, suddenly we should be, but there is something, isn't there, just about the way in which, what does a healthy workplace, what does a healthy, balanced society look like? How are we evening out? How are we closing the gap? Which we know has significantly widened over the last decade. We know that the pandemic has had a massive effect. We know that there's been a cost of living crisis, but actually it has disproportionately affected particular groups, particular areas, particular geographies. How do we focus on, having a sensible conversation about rebalancing some of that? I think
so, that guaranteed minimum income type approach, maybe, which I think one of the Nordics countries have done,
Finland,
yeah.
and it's worked. I mean, don't, because it's one of my soapbox subjects about the Scandinavian. So actually, every single year, consistently, when they rate the top places to live in the world, the Scandinavian nations come in the top 10, if not in the top 5. They have a base rate of tax that's over 40%, 45%. There is a deal that we haven't quite got our heads around in Britain. All of the coverage right now about the upcoming, October budget is, oh my God, they're going to put taxes up. Oh my God, they're going to put taxes up. And at the same time, we're expecting world-class NHS services. These two things are completely connected with each other, what the thing that the Scandinavians have over generations post the Second World War got their heads around is saying, well, we pay for it. We make this investment in order so that actually the quality of our public services is really good. And I just think no government in Britain wants to have that dialogue. I'd hope that with a new government with a big majority, maybe we could start having some of these more challenging conversations about, and I don't think it's just individuals. I mean, business, exactly as Elizabeth says, businesses. I'll get off my soapbox now with that.
I might join you on the soapbox, to be honest.
Come on, there's lots of room.
I think some of the stats that you can see are quite stark for me. Teachers having to come out and say, I have to buy breakfast bars so that some of these children, are able to kind of have something in their stomachs to be able to focus on learning. Lots of numbers around people having to skip meals, or even food banks saying potatoes get left, pasta gets left in boxes because people can't afford the gas and electricity to cook these meals at home. And so the government's doing some great things around, breakfast clubs, or we're going to introduce breakfast clubs to make sure that our future of this country is fed and equipped and that are going to be able to learn. But the balance somewhat is slightly missing. And I don't think the onus is only on business. I think it's collective to try and do something to really kind of boost the economy and make sure that, our people are looked after. I think I got into a rabbit hole on YouTube, and there's something called like Britain's Worst, and it's everything you can imagine. Britain's Worst, towns or poorest towns. And to be honest, there are the parts of this country that have just been left. There's no investment, there's no jobs. And I think as we look at unemployment rates shifting, and then if you overlay where they sit jurisdictionally, there are some really big challenges to be faced, where I do think business and the government coming together could really kind of, work to fix some of this.
Yeah, that collective responsibility thing is really interesting, isn't it? And that rise of the working poor, I think, is a real risk. We all know that we've seen massive rise in food banks and how that works. And unfortunately, as I've mentioned previously, we can't rely on tailor Taylor Swift to keep coming in and bailing out the food banks. So I think I know that we've always, in our village, we do the Christmas food bank, and it feels little just doing that once a year, but it's good to bring things together. And, you know, if you can help your local food bank, either as your employer or as your society, it is that collective and how we do things as a society. Thank you. I feel hopeful. I feel like I like this soapbox. I think actually there'll be a lot of people. It might have to be a soap platform or something bigger.
We can build it.
There's quite a few of them. If they build it, they will come. Is that it?
Yeah.
So on this podcast, we like to talk about something that we hear being talked about and coming about. It's a bit of a familiar segment, which is it a thing? Or hashtag is it a thing, as I like to call it. And we want to unpack the latest trend or buzzword that's impacting the profession. So this week's buzzword is Fauxductivity. And it's a term used to refer to employees keeping up appearances of productivity without actually achieving anything. So instead of tackling meaningful tasks, they're apparently attempting to look busy or maybe mouse jiggling to give the illusion of working. So common examples of Fauxductivity reportedly include looking busy by checking emails or social media constantly, repeatedly organising and reorganising a workspace or desk. I feel seen or maybe attacked by that one, I'm not sure. Creating elaborate to-do lists without any intention of completing them, including adding items that you've already done or completed so you can cross something out, and filling up time with unnecessary meetings or conference calls. So, David, is it a thing?
Well, I think there's two observations. So one, I think it definitely is a thing. It's the only thing that's new is we've just given it a new name. We've just given it Fauxductivity. I think it's always existed. And I was saying before we came in a previous organisation, I worked with an individual who absolutely had got this down to a T, and would spend at least I guess on average a few hours every day, sort of circumnavigating the building, carrying, this is how long ago it was, carrying paperwork, so carrying a bundle of files. And then whenever you saw them, you'd say hello. They say, "Oh, please don't stop me, David. No, I'm so busy. And I'd go off and then I'd go to my meeting. And then, an hour later, they'd have moved about, 5 inches because they'd be stopping somebody else. No, please don't stop me, Amanda. I'm so busy. And that would take up hours in their day. I mean, I was busy. I'm so busy. And I was just thinking, well, she's been on the hallway for about 3 hours. So, but the other thing that popped into my head was the mouse jiggling thing. Have you seen that? So that's a thing that you can buy. You can go on Amazon, and it's like a little thing that you put your mouse in, and it shakes the mouse.
Although obviously none of us would recommend that.
None of this would absolutely. I'm not giving any Fauxductivity tips here. Amazon suddenly sees a spike in mouse jigglers. But I mean, who came up with that idea that what you need is something to jiggle your mouse while you go off and do something else? I mean, yeah. So I don't think it's new. I just think we've just given it a name.
I agree. It's definitely a thing. And I also think you're always going to have that colleague who is going to spend time wasting time and just removing any productivity out of the day. So there's always that one person. But I suppose as an empath, maybe I almost feel it's a dangerous term because actually, are we overlaying what needs to be a bit of rest or a bit of space? And you said, where did it come from? Well, there's always a to and a fro. Lots of organisations have introduced productivity software and, check-in and surveillance. So where does it come from? Yeah. Maybe counterintuitive for it to be, for the software that's been given. But I also think, Microsoft did a study around your productivity and your decreased levels of stress where you take scheduled breaks. So, in Outlook, you can now reduce meetings by 5 or 10 minutes. So you give yourself time to recollect your thoughts before you go into the next meeting. So I think even in Fauxductivity, in this new word, there's something that says, why are people maybe doing this? Is there a reason? Is there a point that they need to take a break? Do they need to take a walk? Do they need some headspace before getting into the next activity and so on?
I think that's a really positive way. For years, I've had green time in my diary, which is time pretty much every day where I'll try and put a little bit of time in just to think. And that might be the time that I rearrange my desk. But it's allowing myself to have that mental and physical reset sometimes, just to kind of think where we are. Maybe we need to be a bit kinder to people.
Yes. Well, funny, I was just thinking that actually there's a sort of emerging theme, isn't there, that connects lots of what we've been talking about today around, are you treating the symptom or are you looking at what the root cause is? So actually, why are people doing, so actually is it because I need a break? And actually I need some mental downtime. And, I think that we're still on that journey, aren't we, of adjusting post-pandemic, which is, the expectation that we're sort of always on or always available. And, we've got umpteen devices and we live in a digital world. And I'm with you, Amanda. I love rearranging my desk. So,
I'm going to start going for that seasonal thing, decorating depending on the season.
Oh, yeah, not as bad as that.
I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it at a future pod, but this potential right to switch off, that's going to be really interesting about how that comes in and fits with us.
In the digital world.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Fascinating.
How do you do that? Yeah.
Thank you. That's all from us today. I'd like to thank our guests, Elizabeth and David, for sharing their thoughts on a breadth of topics, and as ever, you, our listeners. At the CIPD, we have a wealth of resources available to support members with a number of issues we've discussed today. You can find our new quiz to help you maximise your wellbeing offering, or explore our guides, both how to support employees' financial wellbeing and how to tackle in-work poverty, all on our website, www.cipd.org. Remember, we publish new episodes of the HR People Pod every fortnight, so make sure to follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. Catch up on anything you've missed on demand, and please do share your thoughts and continue the conversation on socials or on the CIPD community platform. I'd really like to know about your hashtag, is it a thing? If you can share anything you've got coming up, please do. I'm really pleased to say that our next episode of the HR People Pod will be a live recording at this year's annual conference and exhibition in Manchester. I may have mentioned it's the first week in November. It's our ACE conference. I'd love to see you all there. I've been Amanda Arrowsmith, sitting in for David D'Souza, and this has been the HR People Pod.